Hello and welcome. I know the title might be a bit surprising, but just stick with me, okay? So as the title suggests, I think hell itself is part of V1, at least partially, or at the very least that V1 and hell are intrinsically linked in some sort of way. And it all has to do with this image. First, let's talk about hell itself. Hell itself is, well, hell, obviously. And whilst we don't get much direct contact in-game with hell, besides obviously being in it, we do get to see it speak, mainly speaking through the terminals. It can be seen talking through the terminals as its signature red text. Some of the most prominent examples being the Minotaur's entry in the terminal, the last door before the final boss in P2, and possibly even the terminals themselves at the end of P1 and 2. More on that now. So, the terminal at the end of P1 describes the initial exploration of hell, talking about the terminals and them having relationships with certain machines, and being able to lure them in for undetermined reasons. Along this is some removed links in red text, possibly implying that hell itself has removed any unwanted info. But mainly this entry is sort of a starting point to lead us towards the idea of terminals in some way being sentient. But for now, let's continue. The terminal at the end of P2 describes the terminals as bored, and in that boredom, the creation of the symbiotic relationship with the machines of hell. The machines record their battles in exchange for points and weapons. Sound familiar? It goes on in saying that this relationship is so deeply ingrained that the terminals have even developed the cyber grind itself, a place for the machines to infinitely train and battle safely. And this leads me to my next point, that I believe hell itself is the terminals, or at the very least has given the terminals some form of sentience and is directly using them to manipulate V1 and all the other machines. But why would it do this? Well, for entertainment. Hell wants V1 to kill and slay. That's why it made the terminals bored. That's why the cyber grind exists. Hell is allowing V1 to endlessly mow down wave after wave of enemies for its own enjoyment. But how does V1 play into this, really? And now this is my main point. I also believe hell was the one to give V1 sentience in the first place. We know for a fact that V1 is sentient, due to the new death screen. Now, this screen has already been picked apart dozens of times by other people, but what's mainly important is at the bottom. After a number of diagnostics and a failure to find a vocal interface, it says, "I don't want to die." So pretty plainly, V1 has no mouth and must scream, and is definitely alive and afraid. But I'm personally more interested in the picture after the death screen. For a few frames after the main death screen, the all-familiar eye shows up. This exact eye also pops up on the Encore OST thumbnail if you look extremely closely. So, clearly this eye is heavily related to V1 in some way. But this eye, very distinctly, has two irises. Pretty strange, especially considering that V1 only has like one lens on their head. But this leads me to a very common saying. The eye is the window to the soul. Which leads me back to my previous point, that if Hell was the one to give V1 sentience in the first place, it would make sense. If Hell gives the machine sentience, and perhaps in the process imparts part of its own will or soul into the machine, and maybe in V1's case, made a perfect specimen for its own entertainment, which is why I would want to do this to begin with. So, in short, Hell is the terminals and is using them to manipulate all the machines. And Hell is also imparting parts of its own soul and will to give machines sentience so that the machines can feed it entertainment. And in this process, it found V1, made V1 sentient, and now V1 is part of Hell. And a perfect machine for Hell's entertainment. But yeah, that's all I really have to say about that. Let me know what you think in the comments. That's all for this time.